Yeah, it's interesting. I just was involved in an exchange of letters at Cosmonaut, which is this Marxist publication online, and one of the topics that we were debating was whether or not we could have a form of knowledge that got beyond the ruling ideology of capitalist society, or whether or not there could be a universal understanding in society, or if by calling for one, I was falling into ideology.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. So, welcome to Sublation Media. It's July 7th, 2023. I'm here with CyberDandy, the dangerous anarchist CyberDandy, and we're going to be discussing Herbert Marcuse today. Herbert Marcuse was a part of the Frankfurt School. He was probably the most famous Frankfurt School philosopher. He died in 1979. I believe he was on the cover of Life magazine at one point. He was embraced by the New Left. It was kind of considered maybe the grandfather of the New Left.
The guru.
The guru of the New Left. He of course, as a member of the Frankfurt School, he worked with Adorno and Horkheimer. His book, One Dimensional Man, was a bestseller, I believe. And he also wrote a book called Eros and Civilization, which I've taken a peek into. He was a Freudian Marxist. He embraced both Freudian ideas, psychoanalytic ideas, and Marxist ideas. I think lately his most notorious concept that gets kicked around a lot, both on the right and the left, is the notion of regressive tolerance, which his thought was that given the power of capital and state capitalism, it was no longer possible to extend liberal toleration to fascist ideas, that one needed to stamp out and limit the speech and basically the civil liberties of fascists in society, would be how I would put it. His idea with One-Dimensional Man had to do with how the state capitalist formation and during the Fordist period had created conditions wherein the human subjectivity was diminished to the level of consumer just working to survive. He was more forgiving, less critical of the New Left and the student movements in the 1960s, and his contemporary and colleague and comrade Theodore Adorno was. There's some published letters between the two of them where they argue about the degree to which the Frankfurt School should be endorsing or getting involved with the New Left. In particular, Marcuse was critical of Adorno for having called the police on some student protesters in his lecture hall. That was happening towards the end of Adorno's life. So these are some of some background thoughts I have on Marcuse. But today we're going to be talking about Marcuse as a Heideggerian.
Right. Yeah. So something that Marcuse's, his popularity goes up and down, each decade. Right now, a lot of people are looking back into him, as you said, because of his repressive tolerance ideas and the way that that ties into the whole free speech debate and things like
Repressive tolerance, not regressive tolerance. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah. In his essay, Repressive Tolerance, Herbert Marcuse asked who is rational enough to be granted the right to free speech, given the requirement for rationality that is presupposed by John Stuart Mill and others when they advocate for this freedom. He wrote, "Who is qualified to make all these distinctions, definitions, identifications? Everyone in the maturity of his faculties as a human being. Everyone who has learned to think rationally and autonomously. In Plato, rationality is confirmed to the small number of philosopher kings. In Mill, every rational human being participates in the discussion and decision, but only as a rational being. When society has entered the phase of total administration and indoctrination, this would be a small number indeed, and not necessarily that of the elected representatives of the people. The problem is not that of an educational dictatorship, but that of breaking the tyranny of public opinion and its makers in the closed society." If we grant Marcuse his premise, that is, that society itself has become irrational, that due to the concentration of capital and the inequality to be found in the so-called marketplace of ideas, we can no longer take for granted that formal tolerance of all expression protected by, for example, the First Amendment of the United States will suffice to assure that reason obtains, we are left with another question. Who can break the tyranny of public opinion, the ubiquity of falseness, in order to assist in the creation of an open society? One answer that we can reject is that the reign of the ruling ideology can be broken by the state. After all, if the freedom of civil society has been undone by any force, it has been undone by big capital in conjunction with the state. As Marcuse himself points out, in this society, for which the ideologists have proclaimed the end of ideology, the false consciousness has become the general consciousness, from the government down to its last objects. Marcuse suggests that the small and powerless minorities which struggle against the false consciousness and its beneficiaries must be helped. But they can't be helped by the general consciousness that is perpetrated and perpetuated by the government down to its last objects. If such a force is to emerge to break the spell of post-ideological conformity, we will have to find its origin within civil society itself. It will emerge from the contradictions within civil society and not from the false post-ideological and one-dimensional power of the state. To organize within civil society while insisting upon the maintenance of the repressive tolerance for speech as a precondition for the development of a political break is risky, and Marcuse expresses his fear of the consequences of such tolerance. He wrote, "In Germany, the distance between the propaganda and the action, between the organization and its release on the people, had become too short. But the spreading of the word could have been stopped before it was too late. If democratic tolerance had been withdrawn when the future leaders started their campaign, mankind would have had a chance of avoiding Auschwitz and a world war." However, there was no repressive tolerance in Weimar Germany. As the civil liberties website Fire points out, a 1922 law passed in response to violent political agitators, such as the Nazis, permitted Weimar authorities to censor press criticism of the government and advocacy of violence. This was followed by a number of emergency decrees expanding the power to censor newspapers. The Weimar Republic not only shut down hundreds of Nazi newspapers, in a 2-year period they shut down 99 in Prussia alone, but they accelerated that crackdown on speech as the Nazis ascended to power. Hitler himself was banned from speaking in several German states from 1925 until 1927. Far from being an impediment to the spread of National Socialist ideology, Hitler and the Nazis used the attempts to suppress their speech as public relations coups. The party waved the ban like a bloody shirt to claim that they were being targeted for exposing the international conspiracy to suppress true Germans. Now, some might imagine that more suppression of speech, a more totalizing network of control, could have achieved the sort of blackout of dissent and wrongthink that would have made such a public relations coup for reactionary forces impossible. However, as long as people might speak in private, any such effort would be bound to fail. After all, the value of free speech is the core value of all modern societies, and such a universally successful repressive apparatus would quickly become universally despised. It could only be maintained by violence, and that violence would not be aimed at breaking with repression, but at maintaining it.
He's really like the epitome, I think, of sort of the new left ethos in America, and both in good ways and in bad ways, when it comes to thinking about the working class and the status of the working class as revolutionary subjects of history.
Mm-hmm.
So what a lot of people don't talk about is that Marcuse actually began his philosophical career as a student of Heidegger and even Husserl. He flew to, I think, Berlin or Freiburg or wherever they were, and was actually a student of theirs. So his first or his second dissertation was something about Hegel's ontology, and it was supposed to be written and approved by Heidegger. Supposedly Heidegger never read it, and so it wasn't put out immediately. But he spent a good while as a writer in the tradition of phenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
And, some Marcuse scholars will say that you could see this influence of Heidegger all the way through his writing, even after he switches over to being a Freudian and Hegelian Marxist.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason I think that this is interesting is because Marcuse actually makes a pretty powerful argument for why Marxism would benefit from phenomenology. And what this goes back to is what's called the crisis of Marxism, which, for those who are unaware of that term, it basically means that Marx predicted that the proletariat, provided an understanding of the function of capitalism, would rise up in revolt. That didn't happen. And so Marxists were left trying to figure out what to do about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, my understanding of the crisis of Marxism was that it arose in the 19th century in response to the failure of revolution to take hold in response to the long depression in the 19th century, and that it kind of expressed itself as a debate between the revisionists like Edward Bernstein and Kautsky and I believe and others who wanted to hold out against attempts to break from a Marxist understanding of political economy and politics both. The kind of reformism versus revolution debate stems from that period, just how I remember it, and that it had to do with whether or not what needed to occur was that the socialists should aim to take power within the bourgeois state and guide the formation and development of capital, or whether so that socialism could evolve out of bourgeois society, or whether or not a radical revolutionary break was necessary. So
Interesting. For whatever reason, and what I've been reading, the crisis of Marxism is described as something that happened in, I guess, the 50s, 30s, where the working class wasn't rising up. Anyway, at least for Marcuse, that was what the crisis was, and he spent pretty much his whole career trying to figure that out. The first way he attempted to put a finger on what was going on was through Heideggerian phenomenology. Later, he turned to Freud. So,
I mean, it's certainly true that the failure of the European Revolution overall, which was, you could definitely mark the total failure of the struggle for socialism throughout the West, and certainly within Germany, with the rising up of Nazism and fascism. That death of the revolution required Marxists to reevaluate what had gone wrong in the socialist struggle, criticize the Second International, and reevaluate the struggles for socialism that had gone on, throughout Europe, and then also that maybe the beginnings of a critique of the Soviet experiment were beginning then as well. But this idea that what was going on was a kind of a critique of the working class. I mean, there was something to that, I suppose, in so much as they explored the authoritarian personality that might be attracted to fascist ideology. But to limit it to that, to say that the crisis of Marxism was a crisis within the working class, or was conceived of as a failure of the working class, I think would just be wrong. It was a failure of the socialist struggle and of the party, the socialist parties, the First and Second International, the Third International, the Comintern. Those were it was a self-critique from revolutionaries, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
The following is an excerpt from The First Crisis of Marxian Theory and the Bernstein-Kautsky Debate, written by Terence McLaughlin and R.T. Drake in 1976 for the journal Praxis. The crisis of Marxism was, in the last analysis, a product of the recovery from the Great Depression. That is, the long depression of the 19th century, which had not lit the torches of revolution prior to the rekindling of the fires of accumulation. The immediate evidence for the crisis is to be found in a debate over the significance of the recovery for the strategy of the socialist movement. Marxists, including Engels, had looked for a swift, worldwide proletarian revolution, either produced by the worsening of capitalist crisis, or at least requiring a major crisis as a precondition. When recovery, instead of revolution, materialized, a debate started concerning the role of economic crisis in revolutionary theory. This was the so-called breakdown controversy. The breakdown controversy was an argument between the orthodox Marxists, who claimed that capitalist crisis would continue to worsen, thereby creating a revolutionary conjuncture, and Bernstein's followers, who participated in the controversy in order to reject revolutionary tactics. The latter argued that revolution is only justified if capitalism breaks down. For if the system will not fail of its own accord, then the class struggle can be ameliorated within the existing political framework, and men will be able to realize the continuance of free development. Bernstein argued that the developing efficiency of information gathering, communication, and transportation, as well as the planning and rationalizing capacities of modern monopolies, would increasingly mitigate the severity of crises. As Kautsky noted at the time, Marx and Engels never produced a special theory of breakdown. However, though Marx held only the tendency for capitalist crisis to worsen, and even though Kautsky denied the theory, we still find most of the orthodox Marxists defending the theory as if it were a part of the sacraments handed down by Marx himself. Marx desired to show that capitalism is not transhistorical, that only through class struggle will the transition from one mode of production to another take place, and that this can take place only under definite historical conditions. Marx never lost sight of the dialectic between objective economic conditions and conscious class struggle in producing revolutionary change. However, in the very concept of breakdown, we find social relations objectified in a mechanistic way. Kautsky, the Pope of Socialism, answered that there was no such thing as a breakdown theory. He argued that while Marx and Engels believed economic conditions would worsen, the growing power and maturity of the proletariat would be the decisive factor in bringing about the transition to socialism. Kautsky arrived at his vision of chronic depression, where the continued existence of capitalist production remains possible, but it becomes completely intolerable for the masses. The crisis Marxism entered at the end of the century was perhaps most clearly evidenced in the breakdown controversy outlined above. The breakdown controversy was merely one symptom in a much larger syndrome in Marxist thought at the time. The Marxists of the Second International had no concepts with which to handle the phoenix flight of capitalism that they were experiencing. The Second International had developed a very mechanical view of Marxism in the world. This tendency is perhaps best exemplified in Engels' philosophical writing. Marx's historical materialism was superseded by an abstract dialectical materialism. The concept of the importance of the material in history was transformed from a concept concerning the social interaction of human beings in the process of securing the material conditions of life into a literal reference to matter. Thus, all phenomena, including social relations, became an expression of certain laws inherent in the nature of matter. This notion was transferred to the analysis of capitalism itself, to the capitalist economy. Marx's tendencies became laws, analogous to the laws of physics.
I guess my own personal reason for becoming interested in this is, my whole shtick is existentialism and phenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you call it anarchism or Marxism, I tend to think it will go in a direction of anti-authoritarianism. I think it's sort of built into the existentialist framework, even though Heidegger clearly turned out to be a Nazi. So that's why I happened upon this. And also, I think there's been a general eraser of phenomenology from the past of a number of thinkers that we consider canonical for, today's sort of left-wing discourse, like Foucault began with an extensive analysis of phenomenology, Derrida, Marcuse, like we have. And
Could you tell me, how should I think of phenomenology, and how is it related to, if at all, to the phenomenology that was spelled out by Hegel in his Phenomenology of Spirit? What is it to become a phenomenologist philosophically?
So if you want to include Hegel, a really generic way is just to say that phenomenology is a description of appearances, or the way that we experience that's actually more the existentialist branch. But
tell me what the Husserl Heideggerian phenomenology is then.
So Husserl, the famous phrase is back to the things themselves. And phenomenology is the attempt to understand what the essence of things are as they are experienced by us. So not as something detached from the context of the subject, but the way that the subject is experiencing something is actually where you want to begin. Now, the modification that Heidegger makes to phenomenology is he rejects this sort of division between being and world. So there's all sorts of philosophical problems that this solves. But basically, that's where this whole phrase being in the world with the hyphens in between each word comes from, is that this is Heidegger saying, look, at bottom, there is no division between being and world. They arise together from the same basic whatever it is. You can't have one without the other. They're completely interdependent. And so it's so Heidegger is trying to work out what the consequences are of this new approach to what's called the ontological question, or the question of what is being, what is existence. One of the important things that comes out of this is that Heidegger, and I think even later Husserl, although not a lot of people talk about that, they describe one of the fundamental elements of our experience as being something called historicity. In other words, we actually are fundamentally historical entities. And so you could see that this is something that Marxists would be interested in, because Marx is so concerned with the historical development of society. So the claim that Herbert Marcuse is making is that although Marx is right, he doesn't develop the where it is in our experience that historicity is located and how it functions on a personal level. And he seems to think that this is really important to answering the question of what is radical action, what is revolution, and why is it that people do or do not engage in the former.
So you said something interesting there. Heidegger thought Marx was right about the significance of the historical.
No, Marcuse did.
Marcuse is right. Marcuse thought Marx was right about the development of. Okay, that Marx was right that that history is significant and that our understanding of our being should be an understanding of the changes that occur through historical development. Is that right? Is that the right way to put it?
Yeah, I would say that basically we can't understand what anything means for a human without understanding it as historical. So
okay. Well, hold on one second there. But then you also said, but Marx was not able to properly locate the source or the foundation of history, and how it operates on a personal level. So it seemed like you located it, and Marcuse maybe was locating it through Heidegger on a personal level, on the almost on a psychological level, maybe. Is that right? Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, Heidegger would say, no, it's not psychology, or because psychology is thought of as this kind of scientific approach to the study of human behavior, whereas phenomenology is describing experience and trying to get to the essence of it.
Oh, okay. So on the level of our personal lived experience,
correct,
rather than our understanding of our traumas or the development of the brain or some scientific set of knowledge that describes how we have experiences, but rather the actual experiences themselves, which are primary, but which are also subjective, right? Individual.
While subjective might be also one of these terms that's contentious in the tradition because of Heidegger's rejection of that whole division between being and world. But
right. Okay, but the question arises here. When I've noticed what's happened in our conversation so far is that we were talking about ontology, about the question of being,
right.
and then we began talking about forms of knowledge without even meaning to. And so I'm just noticing that slippage back and forth between talking about being and talking or ontology and talking about epistemology.
Yeah.
Go on. I'll let you say more about
no, you go on, because that's actually, I think, kind of a something that happens in philosophy a lot since this time period, is this kind of slipping back and forth between ontology and epistemology.
Right. So, but what, I mean, it sounds to me like so far, what I'm hearing is that something about being for Heidegger, and then this essay that you pointed me to, I'm looking at the wrong thing here. This Contributions to a Phenomenology of Historical Materialism by Herbert Marcuse. He says that the being that Heidegger is most interested in is a privileged form of being, specifically human.
Right.
And that it is the human experience, the lived experiences of humans that are considered, taken up as fundamental or ontological by Heidegger.
Mm-hmm.
And this move towards phenomenology.
Correct.
Right? Okay. So at that point, though, it then suggests that the way that we experience the form of our cognition, say, has some relationship to the very being, the existential facts, the bare existence of the world, and that would mean there are multiple worlds, that there could be ways of being that are not this privileged human being, but like the being of an ant, or the being
or
of
taco,
a bat, or a taco, or a
right.
stone. Yeah.
Actually, that's something that even in this essay, Marcuse gets at, is that there are multiple kind of worlds, or like, self-contained meaning structures that culturally, or I think he even says like nationally or racially or whatever, are different. And he gets into this when he's trying to describe why class is such an important concept in not just Marxism, but also in his own phenomenological understanding of things.
Yeah.
So
what does he say? Is are there different worlds, different ways of being, different ontologies for different classes in society, according to Marcuse?
Yes, basically. So one of the things he gets at is the development of the working class goes from being a national consciousness, you could say, to being the universal consciousness, a universal class. And this is how he's tying it in with Marxism, is that this creates the capacity for the proletariat to actually be revolutionary, because their subjectivity is universalized in a sense by that position in society.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just was involved in an exchange of letters at Cosmonaut, which is this Marxist publication online, and one of the topics that we were debating was whether or not we could have a form of knowledge that got beyond the ruling ideology of capitalist society, or whether or not there could be a universal understanding in society, or if by calling for one, I was falling into ideology. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.